This is the Authority Company podcast, conversations with leaders that are shaping our future. Hola, I'm Joe Pardavila, and this week I'm joined by Danaya Wilson, CEO of Better Certify, a company that provides hazmat training classes. And as you can imagine, hazardous materials might sound like a male-driven industry, and it is. So Danaya was inspired by her journey and the work she's done to write Changemakers Wanted, your blueprint for lasting impact and ethical change. We're going to talk about how she got involved with the industry, why she wrote the book, and what the future looks like for Danaya Wilson. Danaya, welcome to the show. How are you?
I'm doing well. How are you today?
I'm excellent. Thank you so much for joining me today. And so I want to start by talking about the inspo for books because I'm always fascinated when I speak to authors about, that final decision when they say, yes, now is the time for me to write a book. And for many authors, like it's their day job. But for others, it's just something they're going to try to squeeze in with the rest of the stuff they have going on in their life. So Changemakers Wanted, why was it now the time in your life to write this book?
I definitely fit with the second group where I fit this in with everything else that I was doing. I would say that it wasn't the time necessarily for me, but on a national climate, I think it was a really good time to write this book. I think this book comes in, I know this book comes in as a very strong symbol of hope, especially for the future generation of women's empowerment. And I knew that. I needed this fresh air, this fresh breath of air, and I felt very much like I had a calling, to lead this next powerful movement towards aligning women in positions of power, essentially, in leadership.
That's awesome. All right, so we're gonna get to how you got there. So now I often joke with people I work with. Obviously working with the Authority Company, you're working with a lot of entrepreneurs, and I jokingly say this that I feel like entrepreneurs are psychopaths. Like it seems like the hardest thing you could possibly do, and so the reason I say that is because I don't have a point of reference. I was an immigrant's kid, so we're waiting for that check every 2 weeks, providing for a family. But the idea of like starting a business is very foreign to me. But I understand that it sort of runs in your blood, right? Your parents were entrepreneurs, so that sort of sets a stage for you to become an entrepreneur, correct?
Yeah, certainly, and especially in the same industry too. So both of my parents work in hazardous material abatement and remediation, and that allowed me to kinda unwillingly work with them at the beginning because I graduated with a degree in marketing in 2008, and it was like, "It's going nowhere," and I was still living at their house, and so they were like, Why don't you work with us for just a little bit temporarily?" And so there was this pathway for me to kinda move into working with my family, and then entrepreneurship came after that by looking at the landscape of the industry that I was working in and noticing that I really could impact a greater amount of, change and influence, especially when talking about online learning and simplifying the modules and antiquated content for a new generation.
Now it's funny. So I remember years ago, I consulted with the American Dream. I don't know, it's that big mega mall that's in North Jersey. It was like an indoor ski slope and an ice rink and an amusement park inside. And part of being the consultant there, I had to actually take one of these compliance like
Oh
classes
yeah.
where you sit in a
Uh,
classroom. And this was all speaking of foreign, this is all foreign to me because it's all talking about hazardous materials and where to walk and signs and everything like that. But I will say, Danaya, it's dreadfully boring. Like it's
yeah.
really, really hard to sit there and pay attention for hours. I think it was like a multiple hour class. So let's talk about that world of compliance and training because again, this is your bag. Um, why is it so hard to sit through these things? Like, tell me about that.
Well, the biggest problem is that when you're dealing with regulatory content, it's typically created by people who aren't actually going to be doing the work. So you've got your doctors, your scientists, your regulators all involving themselves into the practicality of how this work is actually going to be done. And so when you have trading providers that come in the middle of it and their job is basically to translate this between the two stakeholders, if you don't have the right training provider, if you don't have someone with like an instructional background, what they end up doing is just regurgitating what's on the page. And so that's why it's so boring because this content is heavy and boring, you know? Um, while so critically important, right? We're talking about like legitimate things about keeping individuals safe and in our case, not taking dust home to contaminate your family. So the secret sauce that I found, one, was that nobody was innovating in this space, right? Because from the outside, it looked like, people just wanted to get it done. People wanted to check on a box and the cert that they could display and move on down the road. And where we started to really, where Better Certified, which is my company, started to really make a difference is we kind of threw all of the stuff out, what had been done before, and looked at what do individuals actually need to learn to one, being compliant with the regulation, and then two, do the job that they were prescribed to do. And putting those two together and adding in, I have a master's in instructional design, and adding in elements of how curriculum should be developed, how KPIs should be realized, what tests should be how the best method of conducting a test. We're finding that students are actually engaging with their content, even though the subject matter might be a little heavy and dry.
Nice. And where you came in and kind of revolutionized things was like I mentioned, I sat in a room full of like construction workers, and it was actually the funniest sight today. I was like wearing a suit and a tie, and all these guys are like wearing overalls and like they're covered in dirt. I'm like, I don't feel comfortable here. But the idea of us all being in a room having to take this class, where you came in was and this is way before the pandemic, was this idea of online learning. So
Yeah.
obviously, you didn't know a pandemic was coming, but why did you see the importance of online learning and putting courses where people could access it anywhere?
Yeah. Um, I had already operated my business for several years prior to the pandemic. And what I was seeing is I was seeing a lot of my individuals coming, a lot of my clients coming to classes where they were driving 4 hours to take a 4 hour class. And I didn't understand why one, nobody had innovated in creating online classes. So there really was no, sometimes a competitor, you want to just compete with what they're doing. So you start offering products that they have. In my case, it was like, I'm seeing this need. I don't understand why my competitors aren't looking at it. And so I really started to dig into that. And lo and behold, there was this memo that the EPA put out in 2007 that said encouraging the states, because if you know anything about regulation, asbestos regulation, which I assume you probably don't, it's it's very niche, but essentially it was regulated by the EPA, and then several years later they pushed that regulation out to the states. So the EPA put out this memo that said, "Hey, I know we created this originally, and states, now that you're administering it, online learning is an option." But nobody was innovating in that space. And so what we came in and we were like, "You know what? We're gonna try it. And we're going to" me personally, I say we, but it was literally only me at that point. It was, "How can I do this on a dime? How can I bootstrap this, work my job in the morning, do this in the evening, and come up with something that has a profit margin?" And it worked.
Wow, that's pretty cool. And it's funny what you talk about the travel aspect for a lot of folks because a lot of these factories and offices are not readily located in urban areas, so you got to kind of go a while. Um, what difference did you see immediately from introducing this into your industry? Because I'm sure, in a way, it also helps with the talent pool because then people the idea of being put off by the fact that they had to go 4 hours, take it for a lot of people like I can't do that. I got a family, but I can't spend 8 hours just to take a class. So tell me about the initial impacts you felt once it came into play.
Yeah, 2 things. One, that I was maybe not necessarily surprised, but happy, that I was seeing this feedback. Individuals who had taken this same class for decades were coming back and saying, "Hey, I learned something that I didn't know I had forgotten." Which was so helpful for me to, good feedback for me to receive, because if I can show you something new about your day-to-day job, that's super empowering. And then the other thing was that, people really appreciated the ability to be in a learning immersive environment without having to sit in the same room as their competitors. So they felt it very nice to be like, I can go back to the rudimentary subject matter of what is asbestos without raising my hand in a classroom with my competitors and saying that and asking that in front of the instructors. So we're finding that creating these environments online where people can kind of just explore, play, create, um, has a better result. Maybe not necessarily better. I want to preface that by saying because online learning doesn't necessarily erase an in-person environment, a learning environment. So what this does is add another option for people who want to maintain compliance, but maybe they don't have the ability to go to a live class. And there's something about like those two options existing in the marketplace that's really good for this entire industry.
Very nice. And speaking of your industry and what you do, and this sort of connects to the book Changemakers Wanted, it is you've kind of painted the picture. It's asbestos. It's like deep, like the old micro dirty jobs. This is a male driven industry.
Oh yeah.
So take us behind the curtain there and and tell us what it was like as a female trying to do this, and not only just being a female, but actually trying to, in no better way to say it, to like reinvent the way it was always been done. Tell us some about talk about some of those early experiences.
Yeah, so my industry is a derivative of the construction industry. I have 18% females in the industry, so it's significant, significantly low. And vast majority of the rooms that I am in have 1 to 2 females in comparison to many more men. What that gave me, if we want to talk a perspective, it gave me an outsider's perspective. It gave me the opportunity to be in rooms that maybe other women hadn't been in and see how men engaged around a topic and without sadly being given the opportunity to give my opinion. But I was okay with that because I took it as this opportunity to learn and figure out what this industry actually needs, what the consumers in the industry, what the homeowners, building owners actually need, and how can I position a product to meet those needs and wants. And I think a lot of times when we're in the middle of something, when we're tasked with a project, we're really laser focused on that. And I was able to kind of exist and be in these spaces where I could, quite honestly, pay attention. So I use that as my advantage. How it intersects really well with the book is I was able to have decades of experience taking complex, antiquated, this is the way it's always been done because we've always done it like this, and question those systems and start being paving my own way and saying, just because this is the way it's always been done, it doesn't have to be done this way. And then, my passion is women's empowerment. How do I make it easier and possible for future generations of women to do what I have done? And that aligned with just, that special skill of making the complicated digestible. It worked out really nicely in this book.
Awesome. And in the book, you talk about the concept of the Rise Up movement. Um,
Mm.
so talk about that a little bit and how you envision it impacting workplace culture.
Oh man. So rise up is a fun way of saying do better. Honestly, it is a way of acknowledging what has been done in the past, but saying as a collective that we're no longer going to operate in this way and we're going to take clear and defined steps on moving forward. And what I'm hoping to do, this is a spark and in a movement that I hope is much greater than myself. Um, I am hoping to attract makers and individuals who are ready to go against that status quo and say, if we are truly passionate about having more women in leadership positions, and this is something that is sustainable for multiple generations. Here's what we need to tackle to be able to do that. And we're going to do that on a collective level as opposed to competing with each other or possibly coming from a position of anger or um, a disadvantage. We're really collectively standing up together and saying, do better.
Nice. And you mentioned the word competition, so I want to peel this back a little bit too, because there is this stereotype, Danae, that you might have heard it, that women can't work well together. They're too competitive. And you mentioned the stat that there's 18% of women in this industry. So if you throw that sprinkle on that stereotype on top of 18% of women, that can get pretty dicey. So tell me about relationships between women in your industry, and obviously this movement is part of it. But like, tell me, is there truth to this stereotype? I always like this. I always quote Martin Scorsese. The reason the cliches are cliches is because they're true. So is it just a cliche and it's not as prevalent as we think? But let's talk a little bit about that between this 18% of women in your industry.
I think that there's a big, stark difference between perception and reality. I think that when you perceive that there's a limited space at the top and in a leadership position, you act in different ways to preserve your trajectory to that position if that's something that you want. And I think that's always been the narrative for women. I think they've believed, and quite honestly, decades ago, it was very true and still true in my industry.
Sure.
But I have the ability to go outside of my industry and spend time in rooms where they are predominantly women, and I am welcomed, I am accepted. I think the narrative is changing, and I think that eh, there is no longer any reason for us to think that the girls' club per se is a negative one. And I think that's really the underlying message between what I hope this book really does too is unite and kind of throw out these these perceptions that no longer are helpful to us anymore. Like, what's the reality? Is she really at competition with you? Or is maybe honestly the answer might be that woman, that culture may not be respecting, differences and open discussion. And so how do we challenge that as opposed to challenging the other woman?
Hmm. And one of the things you write about in the book, and you're very open about it, is anxiety and your issues with anxiety. Um, I think, again, going back to stereotypes, there's always this, oh my God, a woman with anxiety, what's wrong with her? So were you battling those demons too, where you're like, okay, I'm this female in this male dominant industry and I'm feeling anxious and anxiety, but I can't really tell anyone because then all of a sudden I'll feel lesser than. What was that struggle like?
Yeah, I'll give you a story too. I had gone, asbestos abatement, and we had gone on this job walk, and it was I was with a male counterpart, and it was for Denver Water, and we had to go into this building, down a few levels, so we're underground now, and then to like the base of where this dam would be, and w- it was very. Quite honestly, I was in full panic attack mode the entire job walk, and not being able to just connect with someone and say, "Hey, I'm a little bit scared." One, because I don't feel welcomed here. I don't feel accepted. If I said I had a problem, I wouldn't feel like I would be welcomed. It would be judged. Two, the biggest fear was I didn't know what we were doing, right? Like, I didn't know where we were going. I was just part of this group, and I just had to kind of be present. And was the space gonna be a confined space? Was it gonna be safe? I mean, a lot of these job walks too would be going into environments before your team would be going into them. So essentially, you didn't have time to set up controls that would allow you to be safe in the environment. And so, um, I think why I am so determined to talk about mental illness and open and transparent conversation is because it dispels what I went through. It allows people to connect and feel like it is a safe space to have these conversations. The way that I ultimately was able to work through this was that I was able to find small wins and take small wins, small opportunities that I was able to communicate with someone while I was in the midst of a panic attack, and I talk about that a lot in the book. And through these series of these small wins, I started to learn that community is what we create, and we can, through hard work, figure out a way to connect with individuals around us in situations that we cannot control or we feel unsafe in. I genuinely trust and know through this hard work that I've done that it is possible to revive, to kind of reparent myself into feeling safe and healthy.
Hmm. And I don't know if you've ever thought about the root cause of this, but do you think a lot of this came and your issues with anxiety came from the fact that you just had no one else that was like you that you could lean on? Was that a big factor in it? Like, it's not like you could have turned to another female coworker or a female leader and talk about it. Was that a big part? The fact that you just had nowhere to turn?
Yeah, in a male dominated industry and an environment, especially as a female and especially as maybe one or two of the only females, you feel a significant pressure to perform. You feel like you have to overcompensate and show up with all the bells and whistles first before you're accepted into the group. And so if I have, one of my biggest fears was having this mental illness and feeling like, oh, well, what if my anxiety flares up and it prevents me from being able to perform to the level that I can gain this acceptance? And what ended up really helping was having confidence in my contributions. That actually it really wasn't about the acceptance. It was about me understanding that what I was doing was exactly what I needed to do. I didn't have to perform to be part of the boys club. I just needed to do my job. And then from there, pivoting to creating my own company and building a culture and environment where we have both males and females and everybody is willing to have these open conversations and accepting conversations, uh, where I don't have to feel like I have to put on a show to be a part of.
That's cool. And talk about women's advancements, and and as you've gone on, build your business, writing books. Um, I guess, are there any words of advice you can give to women in terms of like helping women rise up through the leadership ranks? Because there's one thing that there's lack of women in a certain company, but then the leadership positions. Are there any kind of things that you've learned along the way that could help women advance their careers to become leaders? So then all of a sudden, because I think there's that old adage, like, to be something you have to see it, B to C. So
Yeah.
that's very important, I think, for a lot of people, whether it comes to minorities, women, genders, what have you. What kind of advice do you have for that, for helping women grow as leaders?
You know, one of the biggest things that I kind of touched base on it with the anxiety. I looked everywhere else for someone to say I was worth it, someone to say, you're doing good and here's a position for you. And it wasn't until I finally stood in that role and said, actually, I don't need other people to tell me this. I see a need and I'm going to fill that need and I'm going to work really hard and I'm going to use all the good that's inside of me to create. The reason why I preface that is because one of my advice one of my advice statements is that I want women to understand that they don't need me, they don't need other people to say that they are worthy to be able to get into a leadership position. What they need to do is have what they can do is trust that they have within themselves everything that they need to be able to move forward and be successful. And then look at the climate that they're with, what can you do within your organization today to be able to move forward? And I can't give a blanket statement of advice because everything is so different. But what I would say is that one, have confidence that you already acquire everything that you need to acquire. Does that mean that we stop learning or trying? Absolutely not. We're constantly evolving and growing. So that's really important. But two, look for what you can do, what's practical, what's achievable within your organization, and what are those small steps that you repeat on a long basis, a long trajectory to be able to get into that leadership position that you want to get into. More personally, the best thing that I ever did because I was in a toxic work environment and I knew that I would never be able to get to the leadership position that I wanted to do, I pivoted and I changed I built my company. And so there's a lot of power in saying that if it doesn't work, move forward in a different route and keep trying until you find, essentially a recipe that tastes good.
Nice. And I should say, and you'll probably add to this in a better way than I am, but like, this is not a battle of the sexes. This is not men versus women. It's not women versus men, women. This is not men versus men. But how can men play a role in the Rise Up movement, helping with women advancement and leadership? Any advice you have for the guys out there when it comes to this movement?
Yeah. One, we're looking for, well, acknowledgement in space. One, that this is an issue, and two, that we're the best women are the best to understand it and move forward with a solve for because there's a couple things in the book that I identified, and we can kind of get into that a little bit more. But essentially, the whole premise of the book is, why is there not more women in leadership positions, and what can I do personally as a CEO to help that within my organization, and then more on more of a global scale. So two things that I identified was that we need to have a solution to the childcare crisis, and we need to have more flexibility in our work environments. So what men can do in leadership positions to aid in this movement, to aid in future change makers also making decisions and changing their corporate environment, is to take up the charge as well. You don't have to be a woman to be able to be part of the Rise Up movement. You can do better on all levels, and acknowledge that there's issues that women are facing that may not be issues that you know anything about, and then making it possible for them to have flexible work environments, as well as acknowledge that childcare is a big issue affecting women. Now we're not only seeing it in the beginning of their careers, but also in the mid of their careers.
Okay. And Um, one of the things in the book I always like to ask and wrap things up when we talk about it is the dedication. You dedicate this book for my daughter, whose arrival inspired me to be bold and strive to change the world for her and the generations to come. Tell me more about the reason behind that and what it means to dedicate this book to her.
Yeah. So my daughter Kaya, she was born in 2022, so she's 2 years old now. And when I became a mother, I became laser focused on how I could make the world a better place for her. And this book is very much a love letter to a world I hope that she inherits. And while I apologize to her 18-month-old self when there was many times when mommy had to come into the office and type away so I could write this book. I hope that the leadership that me, as well as many change makers, will do the hard work over the years to come, and she will be able to get into a work environment that doesn't have to, she's not striving to break a glass ceiling. She's not seeing a broken rung on the corporate ladder. What she's actually seeing is that women and men can work together collaboratively, and we can respect people as humans, and lead in a way that is equitable for all.
Hmm. That's great. Her name is Danaya Wilson, the author of Changemakers Wanted, Your Blueprint for Lasting Impact and Ethical Change. Danaya, it's been a great conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And that's it for this episode of the Authority Company podcast. If you'd like to learn more about Danaya and our authors and thought leaders, go to theauthoritycompany.com.